All right. Very great. Welcome, everyone. I'm Laura Thorns from the Office of International Programs. I want to welcome you to the International Symposium. Nice to see many familiar faces. This program is the Ethics and Philosophy of the University Engagement in Undemocratic Countries. I'm going to let our Vice Provost, Kathleen Fairfax, introduce all the panelists in a moment. But I would really appreciate it if everyone can maybe take a quick picture of the feedback QR code. And do give us feedback. We're always tweaking the symposium and trying to do things so that the most people can join us. So we really, really appreciate your feedback. Those of you that are online, you will get a link at the end of the session so that you can submit your feedback as well. And we like all perspectives. So with that said, then I will turn things over to Kathleen to introduce everyone as well as the presentation.
All right, thank you. And thank you for coming, everyone. This presentation, as Laura said, it's more of than a presentation, a discussion, and we hope to involve all of you all as well. Talking and thinking about how universities approach engagement with countries that are not democratic. And what we're not going to get into is how you define who's democratic and who's not. In this year of democracy and in this symposium, we've had several people talk about kind of democracy scales and what's happening in global democracy. So we're not going to do that. But we are going to assume a kind of a broad definition of democracy and a broad understanding, at least, of some undemocratic countries and what is our role in engaging with them as universities. So joining me today are two wonderful colleagues who've shared experiences like I share in terms of our roles of leading globalization efforts at a university. So here in person with us is Utio Rai-Chaudhuri, who is the, let's see, your exact title is Vice Provost for Internationalization at the University of Denver. And prior to the University of Denver, Utio was at Clemson University and at Cornell and at the University of Georgia as well. Online, joining us is Jeff Erdinger. Jeff is Vice Provost Emeritus, lucky him, for Global Affairs at the University of Washington. And Jeff also, prior to the University of Washington, had a very long and distinguished career at Michigan State University as a professor, researcher, and as the senior international officer responsible for Michigan State's overall global strategy. So both of my colleagues have a lot of experience with this topic and thoughts about it. And in our discussions with each other prior to this, I think we have a lot of ground that we can cover. We also look forward to everyone else's perspectives and questions, so feel free. So just to kick us off, because starting at kind of the big level, 30,000 foot view. So the biggest question at the big view is, should universities prioritize engagement with undemocratic countries in order to foster mutual understanding, potential societal change, or should universities refrain from engaging with undemocratic countries to avoid legitimizing oppressive regimes? So that's kind of the overarching. We can get down to a lot of specifics, but there's the, should we engage because we need to foster that kind of engagement, social understanding, mutual understanding, or should we avoid in order to not legitimize undemocratic countries? And for, like I said, we're not going to define what's a democratic country, but at least at this big level, we can probably think of the big 4 or 5 that we could talk about in terms of China, North Korea, Russia, Venezuela, probably a few others, probably a number of the Middle Eastern countries as well. Countries that US universities have a history of engaging with. So first I'm going to turn to Jeff online. What are your thoughts about these two opposing viewpoints of how universities should approach engaging with countries that we would consider undemocratic?
Well, Kathleen, again, thanks very much for inviting me to join this conversation. It's an important one, and I fully respect that different universities, different university communities will reach different conclusions on exactly how much to engage or not, and where. But I start from a perspective that the world's most pressing problems and most promising opportunities know no boundaries. No boundaries of discipline, of institution, or of geography. And in particular, if you're thinking about the really big problems, climate change, global pandemics, and the like, it's hard to imagine, at least for me, it's hard to imagine a world in which we solve those problems if the world's two leading economies can't figure out a way to collaborate, even as they are in a so-called great power competition. And I'm privileged to work for the last 10 years with a president who was of the view that universities had a unique role to play in advancing knowledge diplomacy, not to partner with the government, but to partner with universities and not-for-profits, maybe for-profit firms, and foundations on how can we jointly work to solve these big pressing problems and to take advantage of these promising opportunities, and do so in a way that in no way, shape, or form threatens or jeopardizes our core institutional values. And I'll be happy to speak more about that later. But it's really about finding partners abroad, regardless of the governments that run their countries, partners abroad that share your core institutional values. And that is the only foundation on which you could then build reasonable partnerships.
Thank you. And with you, University of Denver has a long history of internationalization, and you're working to further that. And as Jeff said, it really can be dependent on the university's both risk tolerance and viewpoint about some of these issues. How the University of Denver approach this issue?
Yeah, see, for us, we are committed to learning across borders. So from the mission and the vision of what we want to do, I think engagement is the key aspect here. I mean, the one difference between how governments look at it and how an educational institution looks at it is that we may be approaching the same problem, but on one side, while you solve the problem through maybe sanctions, our approach to solving those problems is through the engagement program. So we may reduce engagement, increase engagement, but educational institutions have always, I think, been at the heart of a strategy that even governments have used, but we use all the time in providing democratic values across the world. I mean, it influences and educates us on how we conduct business, how we educate ourselves, how we gather information, how we shape some of the things that we are doing here, and question, free speech, human rights, all of those. But at the same time, we have also used that soft power across the world to promote our ideals, our values across all programs. I mean, the Rhodes Scholarship used to do that. The UK, the Fulbright program. I mean, these are in the mission statements. These are tools for diplomacy. These are tools for cultural engagement. So we do believe in that. But, as we have all seen, the world is getting polarized, and there are some significant challenges, especially to some very pressing aspects of engagement when it comes to issues of intellectual property or other things of that kind. So, more on that as we continue.
All right. I know that I personally, my experience has often been that you have to think about it as what you all both have just said, and that we're as universities, we're working with peers in terms of our partners, universities abroad, not with the governments for the most part. So are the peers so influenced by their government in an undemocratic country that it's impossible for us to work with them or not? And that's where the issues of academic freedom and other things might come into play. But, as the old saying also goes, you hold your friends close and your enemies closer, that there's something to be gained from working with institutions within a country that is considered undemocratic. And that leaning toward the side of, yes, it is for the benefit of fostering mutual understanding and also solving these global challenges. So I think we probably would all agree that we don't mark countries just completely off the list for global engagement because their government is undemocratic. So then bringing it down to the next step. So what criteria would we use in evaluating whether or not we should partner with a particular institution, nonprofit, NGO, or university in an undemocratic country? Is there a agreed upon set of criteria, or have either of you used a set of such criteria, a checklist or whatever, in determining whether or not it's possible to work with an institution in an undemocratic country?
So, I'll talk from an example that I lived through. This is during my previous tenure before I came to GU. I was at Cornell, and I brought and created the Office of Global Learning, and combined units to do that. And one of our missions was as global learning to extend out, and we really believed in how to bring various sectors together. And Cornell, of course, led a lot of efforts in those. Some of them came to a head in one of our partnerships with China. And I remember we had a professor in ILR, in our Institute of Labor Relations, Eli Friedman, and he was quite opposed to some work that we were doing. He was engaged with Brennan at that time, and it ended up in us canceling a partnership. And then that created quite the storm at that point in time between a significant Chinese student population that we had, a lot of alumni, a lot of members in the government board, but also across from other students who really believed in certain aspects of free speech, of democracy. This was to do with some of the human rights violations that were significantly going on during that time. And it really put a lot of spotlight on the work we are doing and questioned us as to what should be the criteria. And that began the work then. I mean, I'm not going to go into all the details of it. There was enough press about that for you all to read up on that, but it really, it was a precipitating moment across the Office of Global Engagement during that time, and we set up a committee. And then we really worked through it, and then eventually came up with some ethics and guidelines and operation values on how to engage. We were also, setting up offices in China during that time, and there was significant interest. And there was a dual degree program we were working on. So that really highlighted, just like we do say on a study abroad program, which is much more prevalent, that you really look at a risk profile. And there are certain markers, and you use those as guides. Similarly, for partnerships, we have to question what are the values that we're looking at a university specific to that partnership that align, specific to the institution that align, and then sometimes it goes all the way across the country where there is significant influence that it may stymie or it may promote, certain values of engagement. But those are important. I mean, to have that sense, look through that risk profile, and have a mitigation strategy also. Sometimes you can navigate them. Sometimes you have to call it quits or reevaluate.
Yes, and Jeff, I remember, because I was also at Michigan State while Jeff was there, not the whole time he was there, but I was there for part of his tenure. I don't remember what precipitated it, but there was a bit of campus engagement on a topic of partnerships with particular universities, particular countries because of the undemocratic nature. And there was an attempt anyway by the International Committee at that time to maybe come up with what are the criteria we use in evaluating whether or not we're going to do this in a place that is not necessarily aligned on a countrywide or policy level with our values. What's your approach to that? What was it then, and how is it different at University of Washington?
Well, thanks, Kathleen, and good memory. A couple things. First, as I mentioned earlier, institutional values and being very explicit about it. I was privileged to be on a National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine panel looking at Confucius Institutes on US campuses. And for that group of very disparate backgrounds, including National Security Agency, CIA, and the like, and those of us in higher ed, the consensus was around core values of American higher education: academic freedom, shared academic governance, and the constitutional right to freedom of expression. The International Association of Universities, of which neither university, neither Michigan State nor the UW are members, but nonetheless, they have an explicit set of core values that runs a little over a half dozen. And if I can figure out a way to put it in the chat or otherwise forward it, I can give the URL to the audience. But my point is, thoughtful people at higher education institutions have articulated what are the core values that we hold dear and want to protect in any partnership, domestic or foreign. And I have experience at the University of Washington where we handed back a multi-million-dollar gift to a domestic donor who wanted to circumscribe the academic freedom of the director of the institute to which the gift had been made. But at Michigan State, we created a set of guidelines for global engagement while I was there. And I've done the same thing at the University of Washington. And it wasn't the world according to Jeff. It was a very inclusive process, not simply of faculty, students, and staff who are already internationally engaged, but the very faculty, students, and staff who are not engaged, because there may be some insights they can offer to us about how we are currently engaged that prompts them not to be engaged. But we also need to remember that you have international students on your campus, and particularly at the graduate level, many of them likely came from partner institutions abroad. And you have visiting scholars, and you have faculty members who earn their degrees abroad. You can bring the world to this conversation without incurring thousands of dollars in airfare to fly spokespersons in from your partners. But you also need to engage the refugee and immigrant and heritage communities in your community. Get their input on it. And the business leaders, others, the human rights organizations and like, to come up with, and in our case, it's refreshed every few years because there were voices that weren't heard the first time that need to be heard, things of that nature. But again, happy to share both the guidelines for global engagement at the University of Washington, but if you get to the UW homepage and Google on guidelines for global engagement, easy enough to find them. But both at Michigan State University and at the UW, one of the things we look to is the Association of African Studies. Their African Studies Association, US-based organization, but they have long had very articulate guidelines for how to engage from the global north to sub-Saharan Africa and Africa writ large. So you don't need to make this all up from scratch is, I guess, my point. So it's being crystal clear, what are the values that are core to our institution? And then how do those values express themselves in the guidelines we publicize and regularly remind faculty, students, and staff about? Because there's turnover in students every year. There's turnover in faculty, staff, chairs, directors, you name it. So part of this is an ongoing education process and an ongoing dialogue. But I think it's a great mistake to wait till the disaster happens to then try and figure out what you should do. And I'll conclude, if life was not pretty at Cornell in the example given. I came to Michigan State University and discovered that in the 1960s, the departments of political science and anthropology had better relationships with the autocratic government of South Vietnam than did the US Embassy. And the building in which the International Center is housed was funded in part by CIA grants. So all of that blew up in 1967, but knowing that as a backdrop to work I was doing in Southeast Asia, part of restoring your own institutional credibility is to be able to point to a set of guidelines and say, that was then, this is now, we would never behave in those ways.
I would add that, this is not only a conversation that's happening in the US, I mean, that other countries are also thinking through this. So DAD, that does German exchange and promotes, has been working on similar rules and guidelines for engagement. We look at rule of law, we look at general security guidelines, partnership strategies, and all of that. So I think this is a rubric not only relevant for democratic, undemocratic countries or such, but from institution to institution, partnership to partnership. I think as we are evolving our need for engagement, I think this is part of that risk mitigation, risk analysis, and at the same time, an opportunity to progress, knowing what the turf looks like. So I think that evaluation is really.
I think that's a great point, that we're not the only ones who've been looking at this. Lots of other countries and higher education institutions in other countries are also, and have been for a while, considering some of these very same issues. Let me pivot for a minute and ask a different line of questioning, which is, how do we reconcile, say, a university's activities that are more or less revenue-driven decisions versus what we've been talking about alignment of core values and making sure that there are alignment of the values between potential partners. And in this case, I'm primarily talking about the Middle East. A lot of US universities recruit heavily from the Middle East. A lot of sponsored students come from the Middle East. And I think US universities are very happy to receive the revenue that comes from these students from the Middle East. The Middle Eastern countries, many might fall into a category of being a little less democratic rather than more democratic. And criticisms I have heard is that universities are only looking out for their own bottom line and will only talk about academic freedom and alignment of values when it's convenient or doesn't cost anything. But when money's on the table, that goes out the window. So what's your reaction to that?
It's a great question. We have to remember, before we get to the question of revenue, we have to enter the question as to why we are in those countries. And part of, if you look back at the history, is the same kind of thing. It is using higher education as a political strategy of, influence in that region, directly supported by the government and numerous initiatives over a period of time has enabled American institutions to be in these places. The hub in Qatar, Sharjah, across Egypt, all of those places, they have been there as a way of US knowledge hubs that also create a change in the thinking across the regions. Now, we're out there to promote education, but the way it has been looked at is also it has been generating a lot of revenue. As things have now come to a point where we are facing a enrollment cliff, we are facing other challenges, economy is doing out from the pandemic, grad recruitment is down. We are all looking at recruitment. We're looking at, what the bottom line is. We're looking at revenues. And it makes the conversation difficult, but I think the conversation at one point does need to come back to really going back to that same rubric where you could have revenue as a guiding point to guide what you do. But I don't think you can do it at the cost of why you're engaged or why education institutions should partner and, have a globalized strategy. I mean, that cannot be all revenue. It should be about that even when we bring international students in, that they are not only our cash cow, that they do provide, other intercultural aspects of, democracy, understanding of governments, our role of, being Democrat out to them too, all of that.
Yeah,
And the University of Washington has benefited obviously from large numbers of Chinese students enrollment, being on the West Coast, but also Michigan State had a large number of students from the Middle East. So what's your take on this question?
well, I agree. I mean, it's partly you've got to be honest with yourself about, to what extent is money driving these concerns? To what extent are you actually engaged in knowledge diplomacy, in soft diplomacy, soft power, where you're training the next generation of leaders of those countries, where they will return home with the benefit of a liberal education, little L, and could make a material difference? Or are you just, what you're really hoping for is brain drain? You want to suck them out of that and populate your state with new talent. But being honest about those conversations, and what are the prospects for educating a population that could go back and help promote more democratic, not just approaches to governance, but to industry and a host of other things. And it can go sideways on you. I remember at Michigan State, we, in a program that predated my role as senior international officer, we accepted students from Muammar Gaddafi's Libya. And then the Gaddafi government came under attack. And for a while, all of the pro-government Libyan students wanted to go home to help the government. That was proving problematic. And then when Gaddafi fell, none of the pro-government ones wanted to go home, and all of the ones that had been anti-Gaddafi wanted to go home. And the whole thing was a nightmarish situation, not just at MSU, but every university that was hosting Libyan students. It's no different than training, as the University of Washington did, training countless judges from Afghanistan, not only in Western common law, but in Sharia law, so they actually understood Islamic law. But all of them then at risk, the minute the United States pulled out. In fact, we had been forecasting that for several years, couldn't get much help in getting them out until it all fell apart. But so you have to be aware also of the risks and what are your options for mitigating those risks. Again, one of the places you started, Kathleen, we're not here to argue about what constitutes democracies, but there are a few pure democracies, and there are plenty of emerging democracies and backsliding democracies and the like. So sort of figuring out what feels comfortable. And I'm, if I were to have to stand up and defend the students we were receiving from a particular country purely on the basis of the economics, I can't tell that story with a straight face and feel like, that's a responsible thing to be doing. But if there's credible reasons to believe we've got students who are going home, making a material difference in their home countries, and they can be our partners for the next 40, 45 years, that's something to embrace, however challenging the circumstances might be in their home country. And there may be periods, as there was at MSU, where having created the University of Nigeria in Nsukka in 1960, it's in the Biafran part of Nigeria. When the Biafran separatist war broke out, the Michigan State University got thrown out of the country for a couple decades. But we were remembered and came back years later saying we're still committed to sub-Saharan Africa. So there can be, there can be breaks in the relationship too when things get really, really bad. But as I mentioned earlier, the current president of the University of Washington, what I didn't describe is she's a refugee from Cuba and came to the United States with her parents at age 3. And she's watched how ineffective U.S. isolation of Cuba has been over more than half a century, and is very much persuaded that isolationism is not the policy that's going to change the on-the-ground situation. Hence her affinity for knowledge diplomacy, saying, where can we engage? How can we engage in ways that honor our core values, but also advance the cause of a more just, more humane, and more democratic globe?
I completely agree with what you're saying. The one thing I'd like to add is just like, when we think of countries and we think of people in them, and there's a sense of nationalism, of patriotism, pride and citizenship. Universities are the same way. I mean, actually, I think in some ways more than that, because when you are part of the university, that's almost imprinted in your DNA going forward, right? Your alumni, you have pride in being at the university. Just like, it's one of those things that can never be taken away from you. Once you are a part of the university, that degree, that alumni, that pride stays with you. And that then crosses political boundaries, cultural boundaries, all of that. You come together as one. And that, I think, can really remove all kinds of barriers. And it's one way for us to navigate through the core values of education, of the university, of the learning that they get there, to understand them, to understand why we think certain ways about where they're coming from or where they're going to go. But they can also become great diplomats in shaping the next generation for securities, for futures, for all of that. At the Corbell School that we have, Joseph Corbell was Madeleine Albright's father, and School for International Studies is doing a lot of work in that, and we regularly are talking about these issues, especially now with conflict in the Middle East. It's a very ripe topic. And then we have these conversations and we bring to these conversations different viewpoints and perspectives to understand how should educational institutions navigate this. What is the role of free speech in these situations? But I think it can provide some guiding light in how universities think about this, and all kinds of knowledge institutions think in next steps as they engage.
And I think that the case that both of you are making, that there's so much to be gained from a people-to-people diplomacy, from educational diplomacy, that certainly isolationism is not the answer. And the good that we can do by both sending our students to study abroad, as well as taking international students from all across the world in terms of becoming an alumni for their life, etc. I firmly believe in all of that. However, what about claims, and you probably both had calls and discussions like this from within our own government, from the FBI, from the CIA, from the State Department, that universities are naive when it comes to this, that we are opening our doors and we think all of it is great and we're all Pollyannish and we don't have a view of what these enemies are really after when it comes to working with the United States. And they're using universities as a backdoor to get at this country. How do you, Jeff, how do you, I know you've had to do some of this, with regard to, for example, the Muslim ban in 2017, University of Washington was instrumental in getting some of that stopped. How do we deal with differences with our own government and how we go forward?
Well, it's been an interesting 10, 20 years. Didn't really imagine that this was going to be part of the job description, but it is. And there are, there's opportunities to point out naivete in higher education. But spent much of these last, certainly the last 10 years, but for longer even than that, regularly briefing the members of our congressional delegation, meeting with the security communities and others in open dialogue, and helping educate them that no, we're not hopelessly naive, and also helping them understand that maybe they've over dramatized the nature of the threat. One of the more recent examples is the China Initiative, Department of Justice, FBI. The auspices of it was that, yes, universities were hopelessly naive and there was intellectual property theft and espionage going on in American university campuses. And one can count on a couple fingers the convictions for that. One can count on both hands the convictions for violating basic university guidelines related to conflict of commitment and conflict of interest, failure to report that you were getting money from outside entities, be they the Chinese government or whomever, and you failed to report that both to your university employer and to the federal government when you're applying for federal grants. Shame on you, and yes, you should be punished. But part of these conversations, what frankly was reminding the powers that be that beginning in the Second World War, a series of national laboratories were created on or near U.S. university campuses. University of Washington proudly hosts one of them, the Applied Physics Lab. We conduct confidential, highly classified research for the defense establishment of the United States, and have done so, as I say, since the Second World War. Well, beginning in the Second World War. We've known how to keep all of those secrets for a very long time. And we know how increasingly universities know how to protect proprietary research, where we have a for-profit motive to spin off something into a startup company or whatever. But our bread and butter is open, basic research. Collaborations around the world welcome best and brightest. All our faculty want to work with the best and brightest. They don't want to work with the second tier scholars, wherever they may be. And the real challenge in recent years has been to get the federal government to define so-called sensitive research. So it's not classified, not proprietary, but somehow they think it's sensitive and not subject to the guidelines for open research. And you can't get the government agencies, regardless of who's the president of the United States. This has been going on for multiple presidents. You can't get them all to agree on what is sensitive research. And on a good day, what they'll say is, well, it's everything that Xi Jinping wants to lead the world in. Well, AI is a pretty big domain. Clean energy is a pretty big domain. Quantum physics, pretty big domains. There's a host of these where you've got to be joking, right? We can't do any work in any of those domains. And the US government has done the same thing with Chinese universities. If there's any classified research going on anywhere in the university, or any so-called civil military fusion research going on, they're on our Department of Treasury and Department of Commerce entities lists. And that would be the functional equivalent of saying the University of Washington, you should not have any dealings with the University of Washington because one part of the University of Washington does classified research, and one part of MIT does classified research, and one part of the University of Chicago does classified research. First of all, we'd stop doing classified research because rank and file faculty, if the price was they didn't get to play the game at all, they'd rise up in rebellion. So it's self-defeating for the security guys. But getting them to be in a sensible dialogue about what are the real risks. And some of it's pretty easy to figure out. One of the advantages of the National Academies Committee was it's a consensus report. So everybody has to agree. It isn't the report any one of us would have written, but we all have to agree. And to get the university representatives and the national security representatives to agree, not only on what are the core values, but to say, here's a set of steps any and all universities can and should take to mitigate, minimize the risks of untoward things happening in their foreign partnerships. And it's pretty straightforward stuff. And the American Council of Education, the Association of American Universities, Association of Public and Land Grant Universities, all of them have weighed in with some of these guidelines. So universities looking for a starting place in these guidelines, they are out there. But we've got protocols for when we talk with the FBI and others, and getting them to talk to us early rather than when they're ready to arrest somebody. It's great. You spent 3 years doing investigations, and meanwhile 3 years of inappropriate behavior went on. Kind of be nice if you told us up front what you had reason to suspect, so that we can join you in determining whether or not our faculty members are misbehaving. Anyway, more of a rant than you need, and I'm mindful that you do want time for the audience.
That's good. That's good. I wanted to give a chance for people to ask questions either online or in the audience. We've covered a number of topics here today.
So we're speaking a lot about engagements with institutions and kind of the person-to-person exchange and student-to-student exchange. And I'm thinking about engagements by institutions in perhaps either ideals or economies or systems that are less democratic. So we're talking a lot about Washington's engagement with like the military-industrial complex and perhaps some less democratic ramifications of the work that's done there, or in a much more contentious kind of current state, push for universities to divest from apartheid South Africa or now Israel today, and kind of thinking about how institutions as economic powers are engaging with, again, these kind of other expressions of democracy. Curious if overlaps between your thoughts on engaging from a student in kind of educational capacity versus like this economic engagement.
I think there are numerous levels of engagement that happen. You have people who are from there with cultural identities that belong to that place. That may be part and parcel of the fabric of the university. There may be students that are now coming from there. There may be, partnership engagement that you may have with, a certain country or, institution of that kind. So you have to take all of that and sift through this and say which one is controversial, which one poses threats, and which one aligns or doesn't align with the value of what you want to do. You could have a family, say, for example, who is from one of these countries and who've been here and educated here or has cultural roots there. And, may even certain countries allow dual passports and things like that, have, nationalities of both places. Are you gonna, judge them differently? I mean, they've been part and parcel of the fabric and now things have changed. Or at the same time, you may be entering into a partnership and then you evaluate. So I think all of them have to be taken with a different kind of approach to this. I do want to say, and to your last question a little bit, that our viewpoint is always, as with everything else, we are humans. We come with our prejudice, and this prejudice is shaped by the environment that we live, breathe, and what we do. And that you can see in how the US Department of State classifies risk across the country, right? I mean, a global south or other places, I mean, you need one incident to go wrong and they're right there, category 4. I mean, can you imagine that ever happening with anything going on in London? No, because they are allies, right? So, I mean, we have to take this and sift out the politics in this, sift out our government's foreign policy approach to this and see what the real risks are on the ground of being there. And then think, how are we going to engage? Is it aligned with the work that we are doing? And is it necessary? And at the same time, how can we shape it and mitigating through all of this?
I would echo those thoughts and actually offer some thoughts on how you institutionalize this review process. So it's not enough. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition to have guidelines for global engagement for your institution, so that people sort of know these are the norms that guide our global activities. Whether they're halfway around the world or they're on one of the sovereign nations, the 29 sovereign nations in the state of Washington. But you need then a review committee, and as with other risk-related committees, I want people from a wide variety of backgrounds because I have a much greater tolerance for risk than many of my colleagues I've learned over the years. Did research in multiple countries in the middle of civil wars and the like. It's not a sensible way for most people to live. So you want people whose day job is international engagement, but you want people who are just reasonable folks thinking about the experiences of our students, of our faculty, of our staff, and who don't get any benefit in terms of promotion or pay for promoting global engagement. So you want a very diverse group of people listening, and there's going to be a lot of partnerships and the like where it's going to be a pretty straightforward pass. You're not doing clandestine work, you're not doing classified work. It's a country that's at least somewhat democratic, and the like. And then there's other ones where it's when does it start escalating up the chain of command in the because the worst thing I can do as a senior international officer is have my president or provost surprised by learning something about the institution in the news before they learned about it from me. And so some of this is if it involves involvement with Syria, Iran, North Korea, Russia, China, a number of other countries, Kathleen rattled off a few of them, it's getting a higher level of scrutiny. And then if it involves certain domains of research, it gets a higher level of scrutiny. But you do have to have a core group of people who are regularly weighing in, not just the international office, others across campus who are regularly weighing in, and they'll have different perspectives. I mean, my vice president of student life, who's responsible for residential housing for all these international students, has a very different take on what the concerns of said students are, never mind what the concerns of their home country governments might be. I need that viewpoint, partly because I want international students not only to study abroad coming to the United States, but they pay the same fee for studying abroad as resident students pay. They don't pay the 3-time price differential they pay to be on my campus. So they're very good about traveling to other countries. But the point is, institutionalize some of these, both in terms of a set of guidelines, or Kathleen at one point framed it to us as, do universities need a foreign policy? Guidelines come close. But then to have one or more standing committees that are the ones that say, we understand what these guidelines mean, and we're here to help guide you as a faculty, a student, or staff member. Ideally, we want to get to yes, you can go do the work and do the partnership and the like, but there will be moments where the answer is going to be a very resounding no. And again, they don't need the world according to Jeff. They need the world according to a group of reasonable people.
I agree. I mean, it's one of those things, just what we're talking about between institutions happens across institutions and integrating across verticals. It is our ability to communicate across differences. And whatever those differences are, uh, we may have certain viewpoints that have been shaped for certain reasons. And we have to understand other people's viewpoints to either shape them or to shape ours based on that.
Other questions?
One,
Yes.
sorry, I was going to interrupt for 1 second before the next question. Just one thing I have been meaning to say and have not for all the time I've occupied. In evaluating risks, you always have to evaluate the risk of not collaborating.
Excellent point.
So we've been talking a lot about partnerships with CSU or, with our home institutions abroad and analyzing what kind of partnerships we want to have overseas outside of the United States. We've all experienced a lot of political turmoil here in the US, and we are facing a lot of political turmoil coming up. And while the United States does carry an immense amount of soft power that attracts people from all over the world here, no matter who is in office, I'm curious if you think there is a danger moving forward that overseas institutions are going to question their partnerships with us.
They do it all the time.
Yeah. And how do you navigate that?
Well, that's exactly what we do, just like we evaluate our partnership with them. And we weigh the pros and cons and have a clear purpose and goal as to why we're engaging. What are we going to get out of that? They do the same. But that's true for everything. I mean, every relationship we have, we're always evaluating that, right? We are always navigating to see where do our interests lie, do they align? And then it's always this act and dance of coming to middle ground and finding a place that we can foster together and grow. But they do it with us all the time. I mean, it has to be of value to them. It has to also align with what they do. I mean, like just returning from India, barely not even 24 hours. And, there's a lot going on there with many things that you could question for many kinds of places. Yes, world's largest democracy, but also many would say under threat. And there's certain things you could go there and talk about freely and certain things you cannot. And institutions there are very clear about what work they can do with us and not. But at the same time, that country has risen in prominence now with Quad initiatives and all of that to counter other initiatives that align. So America has certainly found an ally. At one point in time, 20 years ago, was not be allowed, and so it's quite interesting to see how institutions navigate, how those institutions are navigating with us. So,
What are your thoughts, Jeff? Are there any instances you can think of where a partner university or a potential partner or another university in some other country has decided it's not worth the risk to engage with a university you're at or a university in the US in general?
Well, the short answer is yes, and the slightly more complicated answer, I made passing reference to Michigan State University's experience of being institution non grata, not just persona non grata, in Nigeria for a couple decades. Now, that was made less by the partner institution and more by the national government, but it's the partners aren't the only ones evaluating us as appropriate partners and the like. There have been other instances in my experience, both at Michigan State, the University of Washington, but also at the universities I went to as an undergraduate and for graduate school, where as prestigious as they are globally, there are university partners over time in different contexts and countries that have walked away from partnerships saying, the decisions they've just made, whether it's their admissions policy or the research they're doing or any number of things, just not consistent with our core values, which is why I always start and end conversations with would-be and with current, including long-standing, decades-long partnerships, just touching base on, are we still in alignment on core values? I know other instances where our friends at Indiana University, decades-long partnership with Moi University in Kenya, and in the late 2000s, 7, 8, major political violence breaks out. And there's a period where it's not politic for them to be partnered with US universities. Michigan State University, there came a time when our decades-long partnership with the University of Zimbabwe, where they invited us to disengage, basically begged us to disengage, precisely because they thought we were lending legitimacy to the increasingly authoritarian Mugabe government. So it comes with the nature of partnerships. It's not just your institution doing the evaluation, it's your partners time and again saying, is this still worth the time, energy, and the like? What is the payoff? And oftentimes it's not necessarily financial. But I'll mention one thing about university partnerships that is part of why I'm so proud to be a lifelong academic. Number of years ago, I'm in Kenya, and 6 directors of NIH are there with us celebrating 50 years of NIH funding for the University of Washington, University of California, San Francisco, a number of others engaged in Kenya. And they're sort of bragging about that. And I have to remind them, NIH didn't give us 50 years of funding. NIH, on a highly, highly competitive basis, in good times gave us 1, 2, or 3-year funding for certain projects. It's only the fact that faculty and administration at University of Washington were committed over 50 years to the partnership, as was the University of Nairobi and Kenyatta National Hospital and our other partners in country. It's only because of our commitment that you get 50 years of funding. And there's very few corporations, and surprisingly few not-for-profits and the like, that can claim a 50-plus year history of international engagement in any one country. Universities have the capacity, through scrapping constantly for the funding and the rest, but have the capacity to engage in that knowledge diplomacy over the long haul.
Thank you. Great point. And it's probably a great point to end on, because we are out of time. It's been a fascinating conversation. I want to really thank my 2 panelists, Ucho and Jeff. Thank you for zooming in with us and driving up from Denver. And join me in thanking